Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing another really fascinating guest involved in creating a better tomorrow for many people out there. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Deborah Sesok-Pizzini, who is the Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President at Labcorp Diagnostics, Global Head of Quality, as well as Discipline Director of Immunohematology at Labcorp, where she's involved in furthering the company's various initiatives to enhance patient experiences, enable health provider decisions, and ultimately to develop these innovative testing and diagnostic solutions. Dr. Sesok-Pizzini joined Labcorp with over 2 decades of experience in healthcare. She held multiple appointments at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, or CHOP, around the corner here, including as patient safety officer, chief of their division of transfusion medicine, and vice chief of pathology and laboratory medicine. She was also a professor of clinical pathology and laboratory medicine at the Perelman School of Medicine at Penn. Dr. Sesok-Pizzini earned her medical degree from Penn State, went on to do a residency and fellowship at the Perelman School, and she also graduated from Villanova with an MBA with a concentration on finance. She holds certifications in clinical pathology and blood bank and transfusion medicine, is a member of the College of American Pathology, the American Society of Clinical Pathology, and the Association for the Advancement of Blood and Biotherapies, board member of the Intersociety Council for Pathology Information, and still serves as an adjunct professor at Penn. A lot of really interesting topics to get into today. We're honored to have with us Dr. Deborah Sesok-Pizzini. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Ira. I'm very excited to have received the invitation.
I'm very excited about talking to you about the range of topics we're going to be going into. Would love to start off by handing things to you for a little bit, just to talk a little bit more about your background. I think I read that you grew up sort of down the road in Vineland, New Jersey. Would love to hear about your journey from Vineland to Penn State, and a little bit about sort of the early days in your residency where you got into the pathology and laboratory medicine part of the system, and a little bit of how that all started off.
Sure. So my training is as a clinical pathologist, and I do have a specialty in transfusion medicine. I became interested in laboratory medicine because I worked actually as a phlebotomist in college to help offset college expenses. Nice. And later, while attending medical school, I was drawn again to the laboratory, and I really became fascinated with the science behind the laboratory testing. Like, for many people, when you get a blood drawn and a specimen goes into the lab, it's like a big black box. And people don't really know what happens to the specimen and how those results got generated. I've really always been inspired to learn about the process, and including reducing lab errors in the process. So when I discovered I could actually train in this, I was naturally drawn into a career in clinical pathology. I also really enjoyed internal medicine, and I really became interested then in transfusion medicine because I discovered it was a field in clinical pathology where I still could have a lot of patient contact. I had really great mentors who were very inspiring and highly satisfied with their own careers in blood banking and transfusion medicine. So that really helped me grow and develop in that area.
Awesome. And again, when we think about the fields of pathology and laboratory medicine, and we get our blood drawn, and when we see our cholesterol and our glucose and stuff like that, but blood and some of these other fluids that we analyze nowadays are really amazing. I'll say fingerprints on sort of the day-to-day stuff that's going on with their health. Looking back at some of your papers at this time, you were really involved in some really interesting intersections of the lab and sort of clinical medicine. Some of your papers are on topics like looking at homocysteine concentrations and heart transplantation. Some really comprehensive analysis of CD, T cells and how they develop in HIV, in Hodgkin's lymphoma. Talk a little bit about this period and a little bit of some of the highlights of what you learned at this intersection.
Yeah, so those were studies that I was very fortunate to be involved in early in my career. And I think I am very grateful for those experiences because I went to a residency program at the University of Pennsylvania that really supported research. And I think with a lot of the cutbacks that we're seeing now and concerns about training programs, I think that this is an area that still really continues to need to be emphasized and developed for pathology training programs. And I feel that way because I think it made me a better doctor by having these experiences of being involved in studies and different types of studies. I had done everything from bench research to some just clinical research, some case studies. And I'm not a PhD scientist, and there were many PhD scientists in our program. But what I really loved about our training program was that there was a place for everyone. And you can really start to develop some of these critical thinking skills while you do these different projects. And those opportunities were afforded to me in my residency. Now, you'll see later on, I became much more focused and specialized in the areas that I would contribute to, largely in blood banking and transfusion medicine. But I would say those early projects and working with mentors in my residency training really helped to hone in my critical thinking skills and really made me appreciate clinical trial work.
And the infusion medicine, part of your sort of pre-Labcorp days is also equally fascinating because, again, we think of blood, we think of plasma, maybe not as much as, but we're not just dealing here with this one product. We were dealing with these living therapeutics, these really combinatorial agents that, again, in your work, you do things as broad as looking at transfusion in sickle cell disease and platelet transfusion in infants, and more recently, obviously the convalescent plasma world during COVID. Again, some of your experiences and some of your core learnings in terms of this really important living therapeutic that maybe we don't always put up on the pedestal as much as we should.
Yeah, I completely agree about that. And I remember early in my career, I actually wrote a letter to Oprah. She had a magazine at the time. And one of the things that she was asking is for people to say what they're grateful for. And I had written a letter about really being grateful for blood donors. And the reason I was inspired to write that letter to the editor was because people don't realize there is no substitute for human blood, right? So it takes one human to take the time and effort to go and donate. And we don't even know really who receives that blood product afterwards. So that's true for red cells and platelets and plasma. And we can see that, like, even in the time of COVID, we were constantly trying to innovate and how we were going to use these different blood products to maybe shorten the duration of COVID. And in our area, we were focused on pediatrics and really do some work to determine whether that would make a difference or not. And so I really feel like even though the products may not have changed with regard to where we get the different blood. The innovations around the products have changed a lot over the time. So we are constantly evolving in the blood community, how well we, for example, can detect different viruses. And the reason why this is so important is because of the safety of the transfusion medicine. So you're going to find people that enter this field are also just as concerned about the safe practices around transfusion to reduce risk as they are of really understanding the benefits of transfusions. And other work that we did at Children's Hospital had to do with fresh whole blood. And that was an area that was, when I first joined the practice there, really exclusively in pediatrics. And more specifically in neonates that were undergoing cardiothoracic surgery. But we started asking questions. And you know, this refers back to when I said before, honing some of those critical thinking skills in science is really helpful. And we had known that the original study that was published was done within 48 hours of transfusing, from collection to transfusion of the whole blood. But we never really asked the question, well, does it really expire in past that 48-hour period, or can we even extend the shelf life for longer? And we started kind of doing some more investigation around that and published a paper about that. That got a lot of attention in the trauma community, and they became really interested in using whole blood for the purposes of resuscitation. It was something that was done in the military, but not really in civilian practice. And now you're going to see, based on people that furthered that work, that we had started with fresh whole blood at Children's Hospital. It's a common use now for trauma resuscitation in civilian hospitals. And of course, the benefit would be for that particular group that you don't have to, focus on what's the proportion of red cells versus plasma or platelets that you're giving. You're just giving it as whole blood. For us, what was one of the strong drivers is mitigating risk of transfusion transmission of viruses. Yep. So when people don't realize, when you receive multiple blood products in a hospital setting, you're not necessarily getting those from the same donor. And it was also at the same period of time when that practice started at CHOP, when HIV entered the scene and people were really trying to reduce any type of transmission, especially to pediatric patients that they expected to have a longer life. So what we did then is, by using whole blood, is that we allowed really one donor then to be providing for those pediatric patients undergoing cardiothoracic surgery to really reduce the risk of transfusion transmission. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to think about how that practice, and for that purpose, evolved into a different innovative need in a different area of medicine, and that would be in trauma patients. Mm-hmm. And that's what I really enjoy thinking about. I really love the idea of being creative and new applications, and how something that could have been used for one purpose could be repurposed for something else. I find that very exciting in medicine.
Yeah, repurposing has been a very hot topic for us, mainly on the small molecule drug side in the last couple of years. But I just a couple of months ago I hosted Major General Paul Friedrichs on the show, who's now at the White House leading pandemic preparedness. But prior to this, was involved in what you were just talking about in terms of the freeze-dried plasma and in the field. And it's interesting to see how this very, I want to call old intervention has the ability to be repurposed again and again via innovation as time goes by. So that's that's very exciting, and I appreciate you indeed sharing that part of the story with us. Let's talk and transition a little bit now to Labcorp because, as I mentioned in the bio, you wear several hats as chief medical officer, as a senior vice president, also director of immunohematology, and this new quality role. Before we get into some of those themes, would just love if you could talk a little bit more about the organization. I mean, it's one of those interesting things. It's sort of a brand name like Coca-Cola nowadays, in the sense that there's a LabCorp literally about 100 yards from my house. Everyone is familiar with the LabCorp box that's outside every clinician's office that they might go into nowadays. Talk about the organization a little bit. I think you read something like 75,000 employees in 100 countries, and a little bit of sort of what your day-to-day entails, and then we'll go into some of the subtopics of quality and innovation technology.
Sure. So I joined LabCorp in January 2021. And I had reached a stage of my career where I was thinking about what to do next. And I was actually interviewing for chair of pathology jobs. And I was going to, in the first time in my career, think about having a job that would be remote from my family. My kids were already grown up and they had graduated school. And my husband is a professor at University of Pennsylvania. He's a chief of anesthesia at Presby. So he was really still in the throes of his career. And so it didn't look at that time that we were going to move together, but we were going to try to do a commute. And if it wasn't for the pandemic in March hitting while I was on like my fourth interview, I may have ended up in a different path in my career. I'm very grateful though, because I do like for us as a couple, it works out very well for us to be in one location together. And everybody's different about that, but it really taught me something about myself and kind of what I wanted, not just for my professional life, but for my personal life. So at that same period of time, there were different opportunities that were coming up at Penn for me. But the person that was looking to retire from LabCorp, Dr. Dot Adcock, had this job, and she was a professional colleague, friend through my professional organization. We worked together on a committee at College of American Pathology, and she reached out and she said to me, I think you would be great at this job, and I want you to come interview. So I did that, and I'm very grateful to have been offered the opportunity, because I know that there are many, many well-renowned people that could do jobs like this. And I think part of it is just kind of right place, right time, and then really maybe something special that you might bring to it. And I really was excited about the opportunity, because just like we talked about repurposing things in medicine, you're also really challenging yourself. Like, can I do this thing that's completely different than what I've been doing on a day-to-day? Because I moved from a situation where I was leading transfusion medicine. I was highly involved in academic mentoring. And the question that I really asked myself is how am I going to fit into doing something very different, but still in clinical pathology? And what I loved about the idea of the job is I did not have to leave my clinical medicine practice in order to do it. So I was still able to really function for all intensive purposes as a clinical pathologist. And I love being a clinical pathologist. I love the idea of studying the testing, new test development. I like the idea of looking into mitigating laboratory errors. That's on the early side of the testing, pre-analytical or test accuracy. And I work closely with quality teams, both on the diagnostic side and now on the biopharma side of the business. So just a little bit about how LabCorp is structured. LabCorp is a life science company, and we really are focused on science and innovation and offering cutting edge diagnostic and specialty testing and globally. So we have a business units that are in the diagnostic side of the testing, and then we have business units in the biopharma side of the testing. That includes central lab services that are focused on clinical trial work globally, as well as biopharma that's focused on drug development, early drug development. And in that space, we also have, of course, oncology and cellular therapy. We're really excited because of all of the innovations and partnerships that are going on now in the biopharma side of the business, especially with companion diagnostics. Labcorp was the first to develop a companion diagnostic for hemophilia B gene therapy. That's called NABsite, and it's neutralizing antibody to anti-AAV. And we are going to be able to continue to expand in this space. And we couldn't be more thrilled to be there. We have leaders that are very supportive of innovation and science. So they really inspire and drive us to think about testing in new ways and how we can offer those tests more globally to patients for better care. For me, in my everyday work, what I do in addition to leading the quality teams on all three of the business units is that I work as I would a clinical pathologist would, even in a hospital health system. I look at updating reference intervals, our critical values. I perform test interpretation. We are consistently striving to improve our processes and to reduce medical errors, and always maintaining our high standards for test accuracy. I mean, some people think about quality as places that kind of are just very stable and nothing much there is going on. But when you get really creative people in quality, you are also getting a lot of different innovations. Like, we have people on our team now looking at using AI to better perform quality reviews when it comes to study reports, for example. So really interesting things going on all throughout the company.
You mentioned quality a couple of times. I'd love to talk a little bit more about what's happening there, because again, when you go to the Labcorp site, and it sort of talks about this, it's an important triad of quality in the sense of the AccuDraw technology that makes sure, okay, right specimen, right time. You're studying my PSA, my wife's estrogen, whatever. Speed, and you want a whole automation process. You got a lot of robotics involved, and it seems like you get your Labcorp results pretty fast nowadays. And then something I'd like you to drill down on a bit, because you mentioned your involvement in the pediatric environment per your transfusion medicine, but this whole issue of reference interval development and the science behind that. It's like, hey, my son and my testing and my father-in-law, not all the same. And you got to think, quite strategically on how you develop these tests to be more accurate, robust for the three of us, as opposed to sort of one size fits all. I wish you could talk a little bit about that part of it too.
Sure. We have been very fortunate to have some bright minds at Labcorp who really invented novel ways of looking at reference interval development. And why that is so important is because what you want to do when you develop reference intervals is always to have a reference interval that is specific for the patient population at your location and specific for the patient age, and in some cases gender or sex, biological sex. So what we've done is use our immense amount of data and the ability to mine that data as a way to really get more accurate reference intervals for different specific patient populations. Mm-hmm. And over time, we have really evolved into making certain that we have appropriate reference intervals for all types of patients, including those that are pediatric patients. So when we look at what our practice is and our test accuracy, that is something that we're always pushing our scientific and medical leaders to think about, because we know that it's a priority, and it's important to people, because we set the intervals in such a way that if there is an abnormal value, then that would be something that people would want to follow up with their doctors, and the providers are also looking at that very closely too. And those reference intervals then are also not only available to our internal patients when they come through Labcorp, through the PSCs, but also through our direct-to-consumer testing, something else that we pay close attention to.
In machine learning, and so the importance of these tools, not just in the ability to create these novel tests and advance them, but also sort of to broadly look at the data and quality improvements. You are such a large company. You're again connected with hospitals and providers all over the world. What are some of the other sort of advancements in terms of the innovation, whether it's testing in the home, whether it's some of the this real world evidence clinical trial stuff that we hear about nowadays, where there may be a phase 4 trial that happens in the community, maybe run out of the local pharmacy. What are the areas that you got kind of excited about in terms of how Labcorp is going to really make its mark in sort of the future of this space?
I think that Labcorp is well positioned in oncology and liquid biopsy. And I think that's going to become very important in the future as we look to earlier detection of cancer and earlier monitoring of cancer reoccurring. I also think that Labcorp is well positioned to partner as well with pharmaceutical companies, or in some cases, academic medical centers for the development of companion diagnostics for clinical trials. I mentioned our excitement about being the first to have a companion diagnostic for the gene therapy for hemophilia B, and that was in a partnership with Pfizer. I think that there will be more to come in the future with that. So we are very excited and well positioned for that. I think we're, as a company, well positioned to also partner with different hospitals for different testing purposes, for different esoteric testing purposes. We all are familiar now with the FDA LDT ruling and how that may change some of the landscape in clinical laboratory medicine in the future. And I think as a company, we are really showcasing some of our abilities to be a well-informed and effective partner for laboratory testing for different academic medical centers. So we had announced partnerships with, for example, Tufts and Jefferson here in Philadelphia. And it's an example of where the landscape can change, and what we can bring into hospital laboratory pathology practices could be newer automation, more standardization, newer technologies, easier. Also, there could be that partnership where innovation might be happening at the academic medical center, and we could partner with them in terms of commercialization of those different assays, because we have teams of people that are well versed in regulations, also in market access, getting payers to cover different tests. So it's easy to think about bringing a test to market, but the goal is really to make certain that you have the clinical utility studies so that insurance companies will cover this test, and the test would be more widely available for patients. I mean, that's the ultimate goal. If you bring the innovation to market and it's not sticky, and you lose the ability to really then help people. And what we're trying to do now with some of our testing is that we've newly developed, for example, for preeclampsia, is that we're trying to really show clinical utility for that particular test, that it makes a difference with regard to patient care. So I think that Labcorp will be well positioned and more involved in the future and those types of studies as well.
Side note, because it'd be interesting to know. We touch on sort of some of these biohacking themes on the show in terms of sort of again repurposing of the wearable, the continuous glucose monitor, and so forth and so on, as patients get more creative with some of this N of one stuff. But what happens when there's somebody is interested in a new biomarker or target of disease that doesn't exist? I mean, how does that sort of work at the early stages of the Labcorp system? Is that typically sort of developed outside of Labcorp and you license the technology of a specific, or do I mean, I know you have like something like 2,500 PhDs in house that are working. How does that happen? Just out of curiosity, sort of from bench to application.
I would say multiple approaches. We do have some of the discovery that's made by our renowned scientific team at Labcorp. The preeclampsia test that I mentioned is one example of that. That's a laboratory developed test that we have. We also have mergers and acquisitions that happen. You heard probably recently of Invitae, which is a recent partnership for us at Labcorp, and we can grow our business and really acquire newer technology through our really high value portfolios for mergers and acquisitions. We also are able to bring on potential new products or assays for licensing through connections that are made really through our scientific teams in various ways. So, for example, people will reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I might refer them internally to one of our scientific teams, and they may do a presentation on one of our business advisory teams. You mentioned earlier about me being what we call a discipline director for immunohematology, which is essentially our version at Labcorp of blood banking and transfusion medicine. But we have teams at Labcorp that are for every single different discipline that you can imagine. So we have endocrinology, we have oncology, we have a pediatric team. And so the way that we're organized is not just then with scientific people that are really on these teams, but also marketing people, and we have business leaders. And it's where we generate a lot of our ideas and really thought leadership. So you can call these business advisory teams kind of like incubators for us here at Labcorp. So many of the ideas that we might decide to move forward or to find out more about a company happens within those different BAT teams, is what we call them.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. You mentioned some of the stuff that's happening at Labcorp in terms of cellular therapy, and you and I are here in the Philly area, which they're calling Silicon Valley nowadays, and everything from the CAR T to the natural killer cells. It really on the cutting edge, gene therapy as well. You've again, over the years, you've had to evaluate these novel technologies. Again, you were writing, I think, about 20 years ago on umbilical cord blood banking, which was just coming on the scene. You just wrote this interesting paper. This was in March of 2022 in Transfusion. And it was talking about the evaluation of the safety and legitimacy of unproven cellular therapies. And I know this has been a kind of sticky point in the industry as the cell therapy market has evolved in a couple of different different directions. You published this with thought leaders from Harvard and Will Cornell, internationally with folks from Dubai and India, as well as at Penn. Talk a little bit about your perspective on what's happening in 2024 as this space is kind of has a couple of different personalities. We'll just say, I'd love to get your perspective on it.
I really am I'm proud of that paper because that group was from the AABB, and so we were leaders that were on a committee together, and we decided that it was really important to have some conversations around that topic of unproven and unregulated cellular therapies. At the time, I was leading the cellular therapy section, and I really I spent a lot of time with those different leaders and discussing this because it was a committee that was formed of international thought leaders. And what you'll find is that the regulations are different from country to country. What was happening in different countries at that time that we began to really think about it was very different, and it still is different to this day. And it was promoting a concern about medical tourism, where somebody might not be able to get a treatment here in the United States because it wasn't regulated and it wasn't approved and there was no data, but they could fly to another country, and if they had the money, they could receive the treatment. What we were asking about and concerned about in the paper was really, in some of these cases, the lack of scientific data and rigorous, well-designed clinical trials in order to prove that this data was efficacious as well as safe. Because in some of these cases, there were reports of really bad outcomes, adverse events. And with that, there wasn't necessarily one particular area that a person can go and find these things. And one of the concerns that we had at the time, and I think more so now than even when we first conceived of this, a framework for trying to get together a list of resources that would be helpful for patients and for providers, is that there is now more direct to consumer marketing of these cellular therapies. And some of these, again, may not be proven and may not be safe, and people can end up with worse outcomes of their disease or their condition than what they had before. And the marketing to the direct-to-consumer can be very misleading, and sometimes the testimonials misleading. And even though the FDA has attempted, and I'm talking, of course, in the United States, to regulate this, they're constrained too by limitations. And these different clinics that are popping up all over can easily then just go into litigation, and it's problematic, because sometimes they stay in business, and they're basically looking at patients that might be at the end of life, or at the end of their ability to have decision making in a different clinical trial, or participate, I should say, really, in a different clinical trial because of the stage of their disease. But I think it's really important that we have transparency around this. The integrity of the data is important. It's also important really not to take advantage of patients when they're compromised in a position where they might not be able to make decisions that are good for themselves. So providing the most information for them, I think, is critical, as well as informed consent, and not just for the patients, but also maybe for the clinicians that have been involved or are still involved in the care of these patients. So I think that we're going to see over time, perhaps more regulation. We're seeing now advocacy groups popping up in all different professional societies, really speaking to this issue. And I think it's a good thing because you have labs like Labcorp that can actually show what or how efficacious the treatment could potentially be by partnering with different flow studies, by partnering with different biomarkers. Perhaps there's drug development needs in early drug development with animal studies that we could help out with in terms of trying to provide some scientific data and get some rigor around this process so that we know what's coming to market is the right thing for the patient, and that it actually is efficacious and can help in terms of whatever condition or whatever disease that they have. So I think that it's important for the testing to be occurring along with these different cellular therapy products that we're putting out. And, when you have this development going on in academic medical centers, they're quite aware of this, and they are going to be doing that the right way. What we want to do is make certain that others that are maybe working outside of those parameters come into line and also support what's right for the patient.
Awesome. One of the things I wanted to ask, when I mentioned it earlier on, but I know this was a kind of recent paper, and it was coming out of the COVID-19 and sort of, you did some work in the area of convalescent plasma, which is something we heard a little bit about early on in the pandemic. And again, not a new technology, but something that we sort of, I guess, we forget it exists, if not for an event like COVID. But anything interesting that you learned on that particular front in terms of I know we talked about whole blood and we talked about things like platelets and so forth, but on the plasma side, in terms of just plasma therapeutics in general, but in your work with convalescent plasma during the pandemic?
Yeah, so the studies are mixed that came out with convalescent plasma of whether or not they helped in certain situations. Like, you can find papers that support that it made a difference, and you can find papers that you support that didn't. The important thing that happened, though, during that time is that there were people that were driven to look at it because and CHOP was one of them. And again, going back to unproven therapies and lack of data, this was a situation where we weren't going to just transfuse this plasma. We were going to make sure we put some scientific rigor around this to know whether this was going to make a difference or have an impact. And that was important because convalescent plasma is really FFP that's been collected from somebody who's recently had COVID-19 in the setting of the convalescent plasma that we were transfusing. And why that was important to understand is that all the risk factors then that you would get with plasma, and I'm talking largely about transfusion transmitted diseases. There's trolley reactions that could happen, transfusion related acute lung injury you can have with that type of plasma infusion. So we always practiced good lab stewardship when it came to blood banking and transfusion medicine because, again, we wanted to help patients and reduce risk. So that trial was set up, and we had some challenges in getting supply, but we worked closely with the American Red Cross to do that. We also were very proactive in trying to identify donors that can be used because there were certain stipulations and criteria that you had at the time for donors that could undergo the collection for convalescent plasma. And I'm not talking about the standard testing. Of course, that was performed for infectious disease. I'm talking more about how recent their infection had to be before they were collected and for their COVID-19. So we, I think, really showed that we could be effective in helping, in this case, our blood center was the Red Cross, in helping to provide some donors that would be eligible in order for them to go back and that transfusion product would then be available for our patients. So I think it really showed great examples of collaboration and partnership in a time of a lot of stress.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's again, I appreciate sharing that with us. And again, it's it's another sort of feeds back to the area of sort of repurposing and sort of relooking at some of these opportunities, and really haven't been explored. I know offline we chatted a bit about sort of this some of the stuff that's going on in terms of parabiosis and whatnot. But again, it's an area that we need to really explore, and I'm sure that the tools that Labcorp develops around these interventions really allow us to get more both on the quality and the safety front. So that's pretty exciting. What else is coming up that we should know about? I know that you do quite a bit of public facing stuff. There was a webcast that I ran into that you gave a couple months ago. This was specifically targeting colorectal screening compliance rates. What should we know about that's coming up for the rest of the year in terms of talks, conferences that you may be attending, or anything else that I missed related to LabCorp and your initiatives that you might want to touch on, please?
So thank you. So we have a new survey that you're going to be seeing soon in the social media with hopefully a fireside chat with one of our hospital physician partners, chair of pathology. This is called the Pulse of the Lab Leader, and it's an in-depth 30-minute interview survey that was conducted with lab leaders, which include pathologists, lab managers, medical laboratory scientists, over 100. And it included all types of medical practices: community, profit, nonprofit, academic medical centers, large hospitals. And it really was the intent of the survey is to examine the opinions of these leaders about the challenges and the trends for their thoughts on really important factors that are impacting right now laboratory practice. And this could include staffing, equipment, technology, and really just to get their thoughts about what they were thinking about. And I think what we're learning from surveys like this, and even from some of our newer academic partnerships, is we really need to navigate the future in a different way and engage in a different way with our partners that are outside of maybe traditional models or traditional roles. One example is that when I think about this is when I came to LabCorp, I started an initiative with other colleagues, really getting some centralization and some focus in our area of education. We had a few faculty that were teaching, but many others that wanted to become engaged in teaching. And with that, what we did is really started an education committee. And with that committee, when we went to our newer pathology partners, we really wanted to understand, especially for those that had pathology training programs, where their gaps were in education, what we could provide in terms of education, how we could add value to their already existing programs. Maybe we could provide lectures on innovative technologies, or maybe on market access, or maybe something on our novel way that we do reference intervals and figure those out. So what we're really trying to do is to develop these academic educational partnerships with our clients. And this is going to be really important as more and more partnerships in the hospital and health systems are performed out of necessity because of staffing or limitations of technology that we may have access to that hospitals don't. It may be a way of for a hospital to reduce costs or to bring in insights with regard to lab stewardship, testing algorithms, expertise in areas that they may not have, genomics or investments that they may not want to make or cannot make at this time in genomics or comprehensive genomic profiling or biomarkers, but they know they need access to it, and they want to have relationships and business partners that could provide these things.
Right.
So I feel that this is we're going to see it shift in the landscape of how pathology is practiced. I mean, I haven't even mentioned digital pathology and the AI that's associated with that, and the investment where laboratories like Labcorp are making in order to be part of that conversation in the future. One of the things that I think is important too is we talked about in my career exposure to mentors and exposure to the area of laboratory medicine. That's really critical for the pipeline. And what we're doing at Labcorp is really making efforts to train those laboratory professionals, as well as providing internships to expose them. Even us teaching in the academic medical centers exposes the residents to what it could be like working in a life science company in the future. So I feel like I'm very privileged and grateful to be part of this evolving landscape. And I'm excited to see where it will go in the future. And I want to make certain that we're part of that at Labcorp, and in a very good way that's providing really great patient care, but as well as really great partnerships for our clients.
That intersection between sort of academic medicine and exposing folks to, this is what you experienced back during your residency, and bringing this to everybody's. Yeah, I'm excited for the future in this space, and everything you've been talking about, and just it's really delightful listening to you talk about it and see the evolution of these technologies and yeah, exactly where it's going. Really, it's gonna be a whole unique landscape. So I'm really excited for you and the team as you continue to develop these innovative tools and technologies for all of us. So really great stuff. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks, or who will be watching on the YouTube channel, again, you've been spending time with Dr. Deborah Sesok-Pizzini, Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President, Labcorp Diagnostics, Global Head of Quality and Discipline Director of Immunohematology at Labcorp, doing really amazing things to enhance patient experiences, help providers make better decisions, and ultimately bring these innovative testing solutions to all of us. Deb, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us for a little while and walk us through this amazing history. Thank you for everything you do in developing these solutions. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for literally millions of people out there you service via these options. Really great story. And thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed spending this hour with you.
Great having you.